I'm John Mercer. I am faculty at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and enjoying meeting up with the Norseman crew on sports science. I am an avid triathlete. I actually started triathlon back in the mid-'80s, and then about the early 90s took a little break, where we were growing our family, and so I call it taking my 14-year taper, and then I started back in triathlons back in 2007, and continued to do a number of races, and adding Norseman to my resume, which was such a fantastic experience. But today I'm going to talk with you about research that we've been doing looking at triathlon, and more specifically looking at swimming in warm water, and even more specifically looking at core temperature consequences of wearing a wetsuit while swimming in warm water. I've got some students here that have worked on this project with me, two doctoral students, Alina and Borum, and a master's student, Caitlin, and they've been instrumental in getting this project off the ground. So I've been interested in triathlon really since I started competing in triathlons back in the 80s, and that drove me into my academic career. And there's all different aspects of looking at triathlon performance and things that influence triathlon. Glucose, force, stride frequency, sweat rate, all of these factors come into play. And they each play a different role in each of the sports, so swim, biking, and running, as well as our transitions. And so to really understand triathlon as a whole, we really need to take a multidisciplinary approach. I'm going to focus more in on one aspect of triathlon, and really looking at the swim portion of the triathlon. And even more specifically, I'm really interested in the influence the wetsuit plays on different aspects of the swim portion of triathlon. Now, we know there's lots of factors that influence swim performance. Obviously, water temperature, which is what I'm going to focus on today, air temperature, wind, water conditions, including waves, current, visibility of water, and even the sun can influence swim performance. This is not an exhaustive list of environmental factors, but a lot of them. And the sun can provide radiant heat if the race is during the day, and also can influence how well someone sights and swims straight. Now, the wetsuit also is a factor in looking at the biomechanics of swimming, looking at the influence of wetsuit plays on buoyancy. Buoyancy is also influenced by the swimmer morphology. Then drag force. The wetsuit obviously influences drag force, most specifically the coefficient of drag. And this is an issue for drag resistance force mostly, but possibly some role with propulsion force as well. And then I'm really interested in the wetsuit design and how the wetsuit fit influences swimming. And we're also doing some work in parallel with this project on shoulder movements influenced by a full sleeve wetsuit. From a physiological perspective, I'm really interested in the thermal regulation issues a wetsuit plays during a triathlon, and really moving to doing some measurements out in the field for triathlon. Now, from a biomechanics lens, we know a wetsuit can influence performance, and that's primarily through a reduction in drag force. It's also buoyancy force, but really a reduction in drag force is a key element here. And that has led to triathletes to always want to wear their wetsuit in the swim, because they do tend to swim faster, which is a good thing. But there's also a thermoregulation element to wearing a wetsuit. This is a basic model I use to describe movement in general. And in a very big picture scheme, movement is a function of taking chemical energy in the body, our carbohydrates, our fats, and transforming that energy to mechanical energy, applying a force over some distance, what have you. Now, this transformation of energy from one form to another is never 100% efficient. In fact, we probably only get about a third or less energy units for every chemical potential energy unit. The rest of that energy is transformed into heat. Now, a wetsuit is largely designed to retain that heat so that you can swim in cooler water. Right? That was really some of the early stages of wetsuit development, was to protect the triathlete in cold water. And we know that there's wetsuit rules. So when can you wear a wetsuit, or when are they mandatory? And the wetsuit rules vary based upon the governing body that the race falls under. It may also be based upon the level of athlete, whether it's an age group athlete, whether that age group athlete is going for an award or not. And in terms of ITU, it may be distance-based, again, for different levels of athletes. So obviously there's the Norseman. It's mandatory to wear a wetsuit in Norseman, and that's a good thing because it is cold. And I know you have some presentations on swimming in cold water and the influence of wetsuits on core temperature in cold water. I'm going to focus on the other end of the spectrum here and look at what happens to swimming in a wetsuit in warm water. What is the evidence behind these rules, and is there ample evidence? And we're actually going to find that there probably needs to be a lot more work in swimming on the influence of wetsuit in swimming in warm water. So what do we know about swimming in warm water? Well, when you do not wear a wetsuit, we know that you swim slower as the water temperature goes up. And that being said, we also know that when you're swimming without a wetsuit, there's only modest changes to core temperature. That's really interesting. That's without a wetsuit. Yeah, and I'm interested in what happens when you put the wetsuit on, which is really designed to retain that heat when we're converting or transforming chemical energy over to mechanical energy. There is some research on what happens to core temperature while wearing a wetsuit while swimming in warm water, but it's very limited. In fact, these are two key studies, both from the same research group, in swimming in 30 minutes in temperatures of 25.6 degrees Celsius. Core temperature only increased less than 1 degree Celsius. It's really not that much. And in another study that this group looked at, they actually did not see a change in core temperature when comparing no wetsuit versus wetsuit when swimming 30 minutes. Again, the same temperature. So two different studies, really either just a little change in core temp or a modest change in core temperature. What's interesting is back in the 90s, the instruments available to measure core temperature is really limited to rectal temperature, which is really our gold standard for core temperature. But now we have an ingestible pill system that you can adjust the sample rate, and you can get a little bit more finer measurements during the swim, as opposed to just measuring core temperature either at the beginning of a swim or the end of the swim, or having to stop a swimmer to get a measurement. Another thing that's important to keep in mind when doing this type of work is the type of experimental model that's used. In the studies mentioned above, their experimental model was to have swimmers swim a certain time, in this case 30 minutes. And we don't know if the results of the study would be different if the experimental model was to swim a distance that we typically race, or that that's how we usually approach an event, is to see how fast we can cover a particular distance. Now, we have done some pilot work in this area. We had some subjects wear either a full sleeve, a sleeveless, or no wetsuit. We actually had them swim 3 times. We had them do just a 500-meter swim in 25.5 degrees Celsius water in a pool. And oddly enough, we did this really thinking that the wetsuit would retain the heat and we would see an increase in core temperature, but we actually did not see any change in core temperature when comparing these 3 conditions. So in talking with some other colleagues, we bounced some ideas around, and we thought, well, maybe it just wasn't long enough of a swim, or maybe the intensity was not hard enough, because we were telling swimmers to swim at a somewhat hard pace. So brings me to the purpose of this study that I'll share the results from, where we were interested in determining if core temperature is influenced by wearing a wetsuit during warm water, 25.5 degrees Celsius. And now we went a longer event, 1,000 meters, and we told our subjects to simulate a race pace for maybe a half Ironman or even a full Ironman, because they were swimming this event, the 1,000 meters, on the same day twice. Now, we did test 5 subjects. It is limited in subjects primarily because COVID-19 came in, and we've had to shut down our research at this point. So we hope to be able to pick this up and get some additional data. We measured core temperature using the adjustable core temperature pill system, and we set the sample rate to 1 sample every 10 seconds. And we did use just a full sleeve wetsuit for this component of the project. As I mentioned, we did 2 swim conditions. All subjects did the same condition, or excuse me, all subjects did both conditions, and they did those 2 conditions on the same day. We did give rest in between conditions. We had them get within half a degree Celsius of baseline before starting the next condition. Water temp, as I mentioned, is 25.5 degrees Celsius. We did randomize the order, and we did tell them, you know, somewhat hard, but really similar to race pace for a half or a full Ironman. The measurements that we took, this is a sample tracing of one subject's data. This is temperature on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. We calculated average core temperature over the entire swim. That was one dependent variable. Then we also calculated the change in core temperature during the swim. So we just took the maximum temperature and took the difference with the starting core temperature. And then we also calculated the rate of change of core temperature just by taking the maximum core temperature and dividing it by the time to reach that core temperature. We measured 1,000 meter time, so we got time performance as a dependent variable, and we also took a look at stroke rate. All right, here's some of the results for swim performance. What I have here on the y-axis of this top plot is time, no wetsuit, and wetsuit. And so all subjects swam faster in the wetsuit versus no wetsuit. And those are the data there. Overall, about a 6% improvement. The range of improvement was as small as a 1% change faster in the wetsuit, and as much as a 10% change, again, faster in wetsuit. And all subjects did swim faster in the wetsuit. Stroke rate, interestingly, on the y-axis here, no wetsuit, wetsuit, no change in stroke rate between conditions. Here's the average core temperature data, temperature on the y-axis and the 2 conditions there in each bar. No change in average core temperature between the 2 conditions. The change in core temperature, this is the max minus the starting core temperature. Again, there is no change in the change in core temperature between wetsuit and no wetsuit. That is, the change was not different between these 2 conditions. Now, it did trend 0.09 as a p-value, but overall, the change in core temperature was not influenced by the wetsuit condition. The rate of change of core temperature, how fast core temperature changed, was not influenced by wetsuit condition. Now, again, this is just taking the max temperature divided by the time to that max temperature. So this was really curious, and so this was the second study that we did where we did not see any change in core temperature, or really a very modest change, if that. So we went back and looked at some of the individual data sets just to try to get a little better picture of what may be going on. And here's core temperature on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and these are the individual subjects. And here's the gender of those subjects. And again, we've only done 5 at this point. So this is swimming in no wetsuit. And you can see that everyone did tend to increase core temperature. This subject here did something differently, but in general, all these core temperatures tended to increase over time. Here's what the data look like for the full sleeve wetsuit. We've got this period here where most subjects were either lower in core temperature, and sorry, we normalized to the starting temperature here as 100%. They either maintained core temperature for about halfway through, or were even lower core temperature halfway through. And then temperature started to come up near the end. So our rate of core temperature calculation really just took a straight line distance between this max and that starting point. And that may not be the best way to do this. And we need to go back and look at some curvatures that may be happening here with core temperature. So we did, try to tease out a little bit more of what may have been going on here to see if we can capture some of these changes. But in essence, starting temperature, minimum temperature, maximum temperature, none of those were different between wetsuit and no wetsuit. However, the temperature did increase for each of these conditions, meaning that core temperature was higher for the group for the no wetsuit and also for the full sleeve wetsuit, but that change was not different between conditions. We did even consider pacing, whether or not that influenced our core temperature data. This is subject 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 pacing over the 1,000 meters, and this is the time for 50 meters. And in essence, really no real changes in pacing throughout the swim. Something weird happening here with this subject and maybe in the beginning of this subject, but nothing that can explain the changes in the core temperature throughout the swim. So what's going on? Well, the data that we're seeing actually are not that surprising given some of the research that's out there. So looking at, here's some work from Bailett and Hugh back in 2015. They looked at 19 triathletes and core temperature measured throughout the swim event as well for 29.5 degrees Celsius. No wetsuit, because that would not be a wetsuit legal swim. No change in core temperature, and just measuring pre-race and post-race swim. Likewise, some work from Bradford back in 2013, they did some swim flume work in warm water, 32 degrees Celsius, which is really quite warm, and looked at swimming at 20, 60, and 120-minute paces, and no appreciable changes in core temperature. The swimmers each reached about the same core temperature for each of those swims. So overall, the change in core temperature in swimming in warm water with or without a wetsuit is either just modest or it's not different. So what's going on? Why is there only a modest change in core temperature? Well, we could go back to maybe a central governor type model where maybe there's a thermostat that the brain is detecting the core temperature changes and therefore picking a swim pace that would not cause core temperature to go up. But that leads us to a discussion, is the athlete able to detect and perceive core temperature changes? And this would lead us to really looking probably a little bit more in detail with skin temperature versus core temperature. We haven't measured skin temperature, but I do think that measuring that is going to be tell us a little bit more about the story that's going on. But it's also important to recognize that there are experimental limitations here. And the project we did and some of the other work that I've cited here is in the pool. And wetsuits are not designed for doing flip turns or even open turns. And there is a problem with pushing off the wall every 25 meters, in that you can get a fresh layer of water within the wetsuit. So this is something that we're looking at. We do want to get to repeat this study in a flume, and we also want to do it out in the open water as well. And these conditions are potentially could influence how the wetsuit, what role it may play in looking at core temperature. The other big issue is wetsuit fit. Even though we all had, we used all experienced triathletes, there is an issue with getting the wetsuit on the person, making sure it's fit correctly, that the neoprene is pulled up in a particular way so that the wetsuit is comfortable, but then also there's water that's not really being allowed to come inside the wetsuit much at all. Obviously, there's a layer of water that goes in and then warms up. Swimmer morphology is an issue. This is something we need to go back and look a little bit more at body composition of our subjects, or how mass is even distributed and for an athlete. And swimmer technique and or ability. We don't know if swimmer level is another factor that will come into play here when we start looking at the influence of wetsuit design. And then swim time, how fast the swimmer can swim, and even the pacing strategy. These are factors that we need to tease out a little bit more. Even though our swimmers look like they maintained about the same pacing strategy throughout the whole event, we still need to tease out the issue of intensity related to wetsuit influence on core temperature. But taking all that together, based upon what we've done at this point and looking at other research out there, wearing a wetsuit during a 1,000-meter swim in 25.5 degrees Celsius water temperature resulted in only modest changes in core temperature. And those changes were no different than swimming without a wetsuit. So same type of change in core temperature for both conditions. The subjects did swim faster in the wetsuit versus no wetsuit, and everyone did swim faster in the wetsuit. Well, so what's interesting is, and this is the part of the research that I'm looking forward to continuing, is it may be that swimmers are selecting a speed that minimizes the influence on core temperature. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Thanks to my students that really helped get this project off the ground, and they've all participated in triathlons now as well. So thank you very much.